Chapter 3. The Girl and the Colossus. The shadowy creature introduced herself quite well. "My name's Stella," she replied. "I'm a shadow wisp. You must be a human." "Yes," said Sam. "My name's Sam." They shook hands. "Nice to meet you," said Stella. "Sam must be short for Samuel, right?" "No," said Sam, irritated. "Oh, okay," said Stella, not put off by his harsh tone. "How did you get here?" Sam told his story to Stella, and then asked for hers. "I was in the woods," she said, "collecting flowers, when I came across that jar in a grove. Well, I thought, that's something I can put my flowers in, so I went to pick it up. As soon as I touched it, I was sucked out of my clothes and into the jar, and teleported to the pedestal. My clothes came with me as well, luckily." "Do you need clothes?" Sam asked. Stella looked at him, and if she could make human facial expressions, Sam guessed she'd be looking at him with a look of surprise or indignation. "Of course," she said. "How else am I supposed to pick flowers and give hugs?" Sam had to admit that in her gaseous form, it would be difficult to do anything of that sort. They decided that they shouldn't stay standing where they were for too long, and they continued the search for a way out of the maze. As they followed various passageways, Sam tried asking Stella what she knew about the maze, hoping for useful information. Unfortunately, she knew even less than he did. She had been trapped in a jar for all of her time in that room. However, she did know something about the illusions of the place. "They can talk," she said. "While I was in the jar, humans came into the room, and I would ask them to free me. They always said they would, if I could answer this riddle or answer that question. No matter what I said, they would laugh and then they'd be gone in the blink of an eye. It was horrible, but I almost enjoyed it, because I was so lonely in that jar and I wanted someone to talk to." "Really?" Sam asked. "The illusionary spider I saw didn't make any noise." "Maybe the illusions are made for different people," said Stella. "Someone could be watching us right now and deciding what illusions to make." Sam shivered at that thought. The idea of some wizard watching his every step and move was unnerving and chilling. It meant that whoever it was could wait until they were vulnerable, and then strike unexpectedly. "How did you know I was real?" "Oh, I didn't at first," Stella said. "But then I saw you picking up my clothes, and none of the other illusions did that. All of them would just walk up to the jar, stand very still in front of me, and ask questions. You went straight for the clothes, and when I said hello, you looked around the place, not sure where I was. So I knew you had to be a real person." An archway appeared in front of them, and Sam scratched a number 6 on one of the stones, and walked through. "Why did you scratch a mark on the stone?" Stella asked, following him. "I didn't scratch a mark, I scratched a number," Sam replied, scratching another 6 on the other side. "Which number?" Stella asked. 6, Sam replied. "Don't you know how to read numbers?" "No." "Oh," Sam said, a little surprised. "Numbering the archways will help us find our way and not get lost," he explained. They continued down some more passageways, and found a few more empty rooms, and Sam named and numbered them. As they continued, he and Stella talked about numerous things. She was quite the chatterbox. From their conversations, he learnt that shadow wisps originally came from the clouds in the sky, given life by a falling star, and had settled in forests across High Realm, and this was why they could shoot lightning at attackers. "Wait, so you were clouds, and then a falling star brought you to life?" Sam asked. "Yes," said Stella. "Well, it did some 400 or so years ago, but not to me. I'm not 400 years old." "And you can shoot lightning?" "Yes, not very often. It is quite tiring. When I get older, I'll be able to use lightning more. But according to my tutor, a falling star created humans as well," said Sam. "So why can't I shoot lightning?" Stella was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," she said. "I just know that shadow wisps can." After walking for what had to be hours, Sam said that he needed to sleep, and Stella happily agreed to keep watch. She had told him that shadow wisps only needed to sleep a few hours, and she had done an awful lot of sleeping in the jar to pass time. When they found a suitable corner, Sam laid his head down and quickly fell into a dreamless sleep. It wasn't because the floor was comfortable that he fell asleep in just a few moments. It was because Sam was exhausted after running and walking for hours on end without any sort of break. He didn't know how long he had slept, but upon waking he felt much rested and better than before. Stella was still awake and was floating around in circles. She quickly saw that he was up. "Oh good, you're awake," she said. "It's so boring without someone to talk to." Sam felt kind of thirsty as he got to his feet, and realised with some fear that he had no idea where to find food or water. "What if we die of hunger before we escape this place?" he thought. He shared his concerns with Stella, but she didn't seem very worried. "I'm sure we'll find something," she said. "Some food must be here. Otherwise, how would the spiders survive?" Sam wondered whether the spiders survived by eating people trapped in the maze, like him and Stella, but he didn't share this thought. After wandering for maybe an hour in this section of the maze, an archway appeared in one of the passageways. Sam numbered it 14, and then they walked through it, and into a new room. Immediately, they noticed something strange. "It's really dark in here," Stella remarked. She was right. The dim bluish light that had lit all the other passages and rooms was gone. Instead, there was a reddish light coming from the ceiling, and it wasn't nearly as bright. "It is," said Sam, bringing the sharp stone out of his trouser pocket to number the other side of the door. He placed his hand on the wall and pulled it back in surprise. "Wait!" he exclaimed. "This is metal!" They both looked. Excluding the stone archway, the whole wall was metal. Looking around, they could tell, even in the gloom, that all the walls had a metallic shine to them, except for the wall to their right, which was still made of stone. Towards the back of the room, they could see what looked like small pillars. They didn't reach the ceiling, and only stood about 6 feet tall. Intrigued by these, Sam and Stella walked towards them. It turned out they weren't exactly pillars, but more like stone blocks placed on top of each other. Looking down, they realized they had come from the floor. Someone, or something, had chiseled the stones out of the floor and piled them on top of each other. "This is strange," said Sam, walking between them. "They seem to be in a circle surrounding that," Stella pointed. Sam drew his attention away from the blocks and looked to where she was pointing. Only 6 feet away from him was a very large, roundish black shape in the middle of the room, about 10 feet tall, but neither he nor Stella could tell what it was in the dim light. Sam was about to suggest they approach it cautiously, when a white bright light lit up near the top of the shape, dazzling their eyes. When their eyes had adjusted to the piercing light, they saw what looked like a bright red, comfy armchair atop a flat, level platform on the large shape, which was made of black, shiny metal. In front of the armchair was a round table made of wood, which was holding a teapot and a couple of teacups. Both the armchair and the table appeared to be built into the flat platform. The light was coming from a big crystal above the armchair. However, it wasn't attached to the flat, level platform, but to the round metal back behind it. All of this, Sam and Stella perceived more or less subconsciously, but they were consciously aware of how terrified they were upon seeing who was sitting in the armchair. Both Sam and Stella yelled in fright and instinctively clutched each other, although Sam would later say he hadn't been scared, and just grabbed Stella's arm and shoulder to make her feel better. The occupant of the armchair was a little girl. She was perhaps the creepiest little girl they had ever seen. The cold white light, in cooperation with her long, messy, raven-black hair, hid her eyes and shrouded her face in an insidious darkness. The dirty white sleeveless plain dress she was wearing just added to the creepy appearance, and there was the sense of the unnatural about her, despite the fact she was hugging a teddy bear with one of her arms. However, once the girl yawned, Sam and Stella felt very embarrassed about their reaction. But in their defense, this was quite a sudden appearance by the stranger, and would have startled an adult even. They took their arms off each other and watched the girl start raising herself from the chair. Sam guessed she was 9 or 10, but she did not move like someone who was that young. There was a lack of energy and urgency to her movements, and every action seemed deliberate and planned. Her hair, which had appeared to be totally unkempt, actually had some signs of being groomed, but it was still messy, and clearly needed to be acquainted with a hairbrush. Half her hair fell down in front of her face, but the other half was tied with a large white ribbon, so that it fell behind her ears and back. The girl moved some hair out of her dark brown eyes and looked at Sam and Stella. She had a pale face and large bags under her eyes. She didn't look like she got much sleep at all. She looked at them in a disinterested manner, then reached for a pouch, which was hanging off a brown belt she was wearing around her waist. She pulled out something, and then, lifting her arm back, she threw it. The thing was small but clearly metal, and it flew through the air before hitting Stella on the top of her blue hood. It bounced off her and hit the floor, and Sam realized it was a metal nut. "Hey, what was that for?" Stella asked indignantly. Sam felt something hit his shoulder, and he looked to see another metal nut rolling onto the floor. "I see," said the girl on the armchair. "You're all real." She spoke very softly and quietly. Neither Sam nor Stella heard her at first, until she repeated herself. Stella picked up one of the metal nuts and tossed it at the girl before Sam could stop her. It bounced off the girl's head. "Stella!" Sam exclaimed. "You're real too," said Stella happily, as if she hadn't done something so impolite. "But isn't it clear we're real?" "That's what the last illusion asked," the girl replied, unfazed. "They keep coming to talk to me, and try to approach me or Herbert. But whenever they get close, they just walk through us. Clearly illusions." She stood up from her armchair, putting the teddy bear down. "So I formed a hypothesis that the illusions could not actually perceive anything but sound, and I asked Herbert to build those pillars. The tests were conclusive. The illusions would just walk through the pillars, while real spiders would walk around them. Quaestio hypothesis experimentium inquisito arbitrium. My current hypothesis is that whoever is responsible for these illusions has only a few illusion types, which can only perform a set number of actions according to limited stimuli." The girl continued. "I've been keeping an account of what each illusionary person looks like, and what their answers are to certain questions. Alas, the number of illusionary persons approaching us has decreased, but the number of spiders, fake and real, has increased." Sam and Stella looked at each other very much confused. They had barely understood anything the girl had said, other than the bits where she had been visited by lots of illusionary people. Interesting, Sam said, not sure how to respond. "We have been making marks on archways," Stella said. "Well, Sam has, not me. I'm Stella, and it's nice to meet you." "I'm called Morgana," the girl said. "I shall come down. I just need to wake up Herbert." Sam thought that Herbert had to be her teddy bear, but she didn't pick it up again. Instead, she knelt on the platform and lowered her head over its edge. "Herbert, wake up," she whispered. Gears turning, the sound of a giant awakening, and heavy metal moving into motion were heard in the order described. The noises of a hot fire fanning itself emitted from near the floor, and then there was a flash of white light, blinding Sam and Stella for a couple of seconds. The light dimmed, and their eyes adjusted to see a large, rectangular-shaped, angled metal head, containing a flat plane of glass that was the source of the light. There was the sound of metal components moving, and the head turned to look down on them. The head didn't move after this, but it was rising higher off the floor. In fact, the platform Morgana was kneeling on, which was situated above the mechanical head, was rising too, along with the whole round metal shape. Then Sam saw it. Far back, attached to the bottom of the metal body, was what looked like a big metal corkscrew, which was heating up the air around it, turning it fuzzy and thick. The corkscrew was lifting the entire metal behemoth off the ground, for about a foot, until it was hovering in the air. Again there was the sound of metal components turning, but it wasn't the head that was moving, it was something beneath it. Then, out from underneath the metal body, came a dozen or so long metal arms with mining picks attached. They gleamed in the light, coming from the mechanical head, and Sam and Stella leapt back in fright upon seeing these deadly tools. The metal creature was completely still, and now, no longer distracted by the various moving components of the thing in front of him. Sam saw that, in spite of the platform and the fact it was hovering, it resembled a shiny black beetle. A beetle which was 10 feet tall and easily 6 feet wide. Both he and Stella stood there in shock. "Help me down," Morgana said, lowering her legs over the side of the platform. "And reheat the tea, please." 4 arms of the metal creature moved upwards to the platform, which was 6 feet off the ground. The first 2 arranged themselves beneath Morgana's feet, the picks turned sideways, so they would not cut through her dirty white slippers. She stepped onto them, and the arms moved gently down towards the floor and in front of Sam and Stella. The second pair of arms at the same time moved towards the table, where the tray with the teapot and cups was sitting. Carefully and deliberately, the picks on the arms slid underneath the tray, and lifted it off the table, and then carried it down beneath the body, to where the corkscrew device was. Something seemed to open next to the corkscrew, and the tray went up inside the metal body. "So, this is Herbert?" Stella asked, surprised. "Yes," said Morgana, stepping off the arms and onto the floor. "He and I have been friends a year now." "What exactly is he?" Sam asked, as he watched the arms of the metal creature move back into position beneath its head. "He is a colossus," Morgana said. "A colossus specifically developed for mining." At the academy, I found him in one of the old collapsed copper mines which I used to explore. I and some colleagues managed to bring him out and repair him. Academy? Sam asked. What academy did you come from, and how did you get here? Gretel's Academy for Gifted Orphans, Morgana replied. You don't have any parents? Stella asked sadly. I'm so sorry. She moved closer to Morgana and hugged her. Morgana stood motionless and didn't hug her back. Herbert and I were walking next to the wall of the academy, and we came across a boot, she said, looking at Sam. When Herbert hovered over it, we were teleported into a room inside this labyrinth. I still have the boot. Morgana patted a pouch on her belt, an action not made simple by Stella, who was still hugging her. Naturally, we wanted to escape, she said. I reasoned that if we went in one direction constantly, we would come out of this labyrinth. So I asked Herbert to mine forwards, and we smashed our way through the walls, thus circumventing the puzzle of the mazes. The stones in the walls kept repairing themselves, but Herbert was too fast for the enchantments. We then ended up here, and as you can see, the wall ahead is made of metal, and is too tough for Herbert's picks. So what have you been doing here? Stella asked, still hugging Morgana, surprised, Sam thought, that she wasn't being hugged back. There's a door, said Morgana. I'm trying to figure out how the mechanism works to open it. I will admit to being distracted by the illusions and spiders. I've made some interesting discoveries. I shall show you. Morgana gently pushed Stella off her, and began to walk slowly towards the edge of the room. Light, please, she said. Herbert turned his head to where Morgana was walking, and Sam yelled. Don't worry, it's dead, said Morgana. Sam looked closely, and saw that the spider lying on its back wasn't moving. It also appeared to have had its belly cut open, so it had to be dead. Nevertheless, neither he nor Stella moved closer. Morgana, however, approached the thing fearlessly, without a hesitant step. In fact, she was even humming softly, and there was a subtle skip in her stride. She reached into one of the several pouches on her belt, and pulled out a pair of elbow-high brown leather gloves, and began putting them on. Herbert hit this one on the head, she said, while I was trying to work out the symbols on the door. Since I have never seen spiders this big, I wanted to do a dissection to see what I could learn about them. Morgana poked a gloved hand into the deep stomach of the hideous creature. As you can see here, she said, oblivious to the fact that neither Sam nor Stella were next to her, so they couldn't see what she was pointing at. This is where the spinnerets should be. Oh, and the silk glands. But both are missing, so this spider can't make webs, and this might explain why all the spiders I've seen have tried attacking me. They appear to be actively hunting, rather than setting traps for prey. She began walking around to the head of the spider. I couldn't find an ovary, so I assumed that this was a male spider, she said, standing next to the head of the arachnid. However, I couldn't find any male reproductive organs in the abdomen, so I thought they might be in the pedipalps. Morgana picked up one of the fang things lying on the floor next to the head. But there's nothing in them, as you can see, she said, her gloved fingers pulling apart a slit that had been cut into the fang thing. Only muscle and... That's very interesting, Stella interrupted. She wasn't looking at either Morgana or the thing in her hands, and the shadows in her hood were no longer stationary, but instead rippling like water after a stone has been thrown into it. I think I've learnt everything I need to know about these spiders. Could you please put that thing down? Isn't it interesting, though? Morgana asked. Sam said. He had found it hard to pay any attention to what Morgana was saying. He had been too disgusted at the ugly sight of the dead spider to really care much for the quirks of its anatomy. Most of the words he had heard he didn't understand anyway. What's interesting about it? It's not male or female, Morgana replied. Not male or female? You mean it's not a boy or a girl? Stella asked. How is that possible? Everything has to be either a boy or a girl, unless it is a tree or a rock, or something like that. Hang on, said Sam, remembering something his tutor had taught him during a lesson. Some insects aren't male or female, right? Like worker ants and bees? Technically, worker ants and bees are female but can't reproduce, Morgana said quietly. This spider just isn't either. However, I believe this spider could be a somewhat reasonable analogue to a worker ant. My hypothesis is that these spiders are part of some colony-like structure, with a queen and different castes of worker spider. Perhaps there is a caste of worker spider which can spin silk. You mean, said Sam, his mind flooded with images of a large ant nest he and his father had stumbled across in one of their fields. There could be hundreds or thousands of these spiders? It's possible, said Morgana factually. Sam felt sick. Images of him stumbling through one of the passageways in the maze and walking into giant cobwebs filled his mind, along with pictures of hundreds of giant spiders swarming at him. I also managed to take out one of the poison glands, said Morgana, bending down. She lifted something gooey, soft, squishy, and yellow off the floor. It was wet, and some translucent liquid was dripping off it. The whole thing looked disgusting. Sam felt his legs go weak, and if he had any food in his stomach, he would have thrown it up. Eek! Stella cried, spinning around, the shadows in her hood rippling like waves on a lake. Put that awful thing down, I can't stand the sight of it. I don't have an alchemy set, but I have learned that the venom isn't very powerful, Morgana said. Ignoring Stella's exclamations, I injected it into that spider over there. She pointed to another dead spider about 20 feet away. It made it sleep for about half an hour. I'm afraid I do not have a timepiece, so I cannot measure time accurately. Sam was about to ask how Morgana managed to keep the other spider still so she could poison it, but then decided he didn't want to know. Fortunately, the conversation shifted, because Herbert was bringing out the tea tray from beneath his metallic stomach. Oh, thanks, Herbert, Morgana said, carefully putting the poison gland back on the floor, as if it was something delicate. She walked to the tea tray that Herbert was holding. He lowered it to her, like a servant offering a tray of sweets to a princess. Would you like any tea? Morgana asked, taking her gloves off. Sam didn't know what tea was, but he could infer from the cups on the tray that it had to be a drinkable liquid, and he was thirsty, having drunk nothing at all since being teleported into this maze. The mere prospect and thought of quenching his thirst made him feel much happier. He said yes, as did Stella. Morgana asked Herbert to pour 3 cups, and he lifted up one of his arms, which ended in what looked like a massive pair of scissors. Herbert moved one of the scissor blades in between the handle of the teapot, lifted it up, and then began to pour the tea into the cups. 3 more of these scissor hands then emerged from underneath his body and lifted up the cups and passed one to each of them. The delicate china cup was hot, but not too hot for Sam to hold. It contained a black liquid, and it didn't look very appetizing at all. Sam thought he would wait until it cooled down, but Stella decided to drink it at once. It was a strange sight. Several shadowy tendrils came out of her face and formed a funnel around the cup. Then there was the sound of a loud slurp, and when the tendrils left the teacup, it was empty. I'm honestly not sure what to make of it, said Stella. It's better with milk, replied Morgana, blowing on her tea gently and taking a small sip. We shouldn't waste time, said Sam, taking a small sip from his cup. He grimaced. The stuff was bitter and horrible, but he knew he'd have to keep drinking, partly out of politeness, but mostly because he was really quite thirsty. What was the thing on this door you were talking about? Over there, said Morgana, waving without energy to the wall behind her. Follow me. Sam and Stella did their best not to look at the dead spiders as they followed Morgana to the metal wall. Sure enough, there was a massive round metal door, so large that even the 10-foot tall Herbert could have fitted through it if it were open. Next to the door was some writing, and just below a strange mechanism consisting of 4 large dials. They were made of metal and were very wide, and reminded Sam of the millstones in John's windmill back in Tolheath. On the dials were pictures of hundreds of different animals and objects. Each dial had an arrow, which looked as if it could be turned by a lever underneath it. I believe it is a puzzle of some kind, said Morgana, but I can't read the writing, so I've been using a process of trial and error to open it. You said that Herbert is a mining colossus, Stella said. Why don't you just make a tunnel underneath the door? Already attempted, Morgana replied. The ground beneath the door isn't solid rock, it's loose soil. Herbert would never be able to dig a tunnel big enough for himself without it collapsing. Sam looked closely at the writing above each dial, and found he could read it perfectly. Why can't you read this? He asked Morgana. It's not written in a foreign language, and you've already said you can write. I can only read and write the language of inquiry, Morgana said. Graecum est, non legitur. What does it say? Stella asked. Sam read out the writing above the first dial. I soar between water and sky. I am the fearsome dragon of the teeny, but the pest of the large. It appears to be a riddle. I love riddles, Stella said. What are the options on the dial? She took a few seconds to look at them, and before Sam even had a chance to take in the animals properly, she was turning the lever. The answer is obvious, Stella said. It's a dragonfly. As she turned the arrow so it was pointing at the symbol of the dragonfly, there was the sound of a loud clunking noise inside the metal walls. I'd know that sound anywhere, said Morgana. It's a bolt being undone. Yes, said Sam, punching the air. Good work, Stella. We might get out of here after all. In his mind, Sam could see the beautiful countryside outside the door, fields of tall grass, and a long, white road leading home. He wasn't the only one excited by the prospect of escape and freedom. A spirit of positivity had now infected everyone. Sam found it difficult not to jump as he read out the riddles above the dials. Stella was speaking so fast that it was hard to hear what the answers were, and she kept spinning around in circles, causing her skirt to twirl in a pretty fashion. Morgana was as quiet as ever, but Sam noticed that she was sipping her tea with more energy than before. Each riddle was surprisingly easy, except for the last one. "Could you please read it out again?" Stella asked. Sam did so. "I am everywhere, but I am unseen. I can be seen, but also cannot be seen. Everyone knows I'm here, but walks through and beside me. No one adores me, but everyone starts with me. It was from me the hands of the World Maker made everything." "This is not an animal," said Stella. "Since this is the last riddle," said Morgana, "and since we know we've done the last 3 correctly, couldn't we just use a process of elimination to answer this one?" "Process of what?" Stella asked. "Do every possible answer until we get the right one," Morgana explained. "That would take a while," said Stella, pointing at the dial. "There are easily 100 answers on this one. Besides, I'm sure we can figure it out if we put our minds to it." They all stood looking at the dial in silent contemplation. Sam tried thinking of the possibilities. How could something be unseen and yet be everywhere? How could you walk through something? Could it be air? No, air was something. It wasn't nothing. Then it all clicked. Sam looked at the words. "From me, the hands of the World Maker made everything." He walked to the dial and began looking at all the possible answers. He ignored the symbols of animals, humans, and other physical objects, until he found it. A blank section of the dial. Keeping his eyes on it, he took hold of the lever and began to turn the arrow towards the blank section. "I've got it," he said. The arrow was now pointing at the empty section. The next few seconds were filled with the familiar sound of a bolt mechanism moving within the walls. "Yes!" Stella cried. "We're getting out of here," Sam said. Then the doors began to creak and groan. Everyone stood back as the doors started to open inwards. Everyone waited with excited anticipation for the sight of the outside world. But their hopes were dashed. "No!" Sam yelled, angrily. He was unable to help himself. He ran to the doors, which were still opening, and began kicking them with rage. The doors were opening to another passageway.